Hello, everybody. Welcome to a class titled The Mysterious City of Hebron. And it's in loving memory of Avram Ber Ben Yosef Ephraim Halevi upon his third yahrzeit this Shabbos, Cheshvan 25. Dedicated by his son Greg. And it's appropriate because this parsha does talk about, this chapter does discuss the passing of Sarah. The passing of Sarah, and yet the chapter is called Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, as I've explained a number of times, and that is because the true life and legacy of a human being is only really appreciated and seen after they physically are no longer here. Hence, appropriate to dedicate the class in the name of a yahrzeit, because when we Jews, life does not end; it just continues on a different stage of the journey. So the interesting thing, this chapter, as well as the last chapter in Genesis, Vayechi Yaakov, both are named the life of Sarah and Jacob lived in chapters that describe from the outset their deaths, which would seem actually even what's called false advertising. What are they called? Truth in advertising. You read the chapter, you think it's going to be the life of Sarah, and you read about her death in the first verse, that she lived 127 years in Kiryat Arba, Hebron, and that's where she passes away, and her burial, and Abraham purchasing a burial plot for her, etc. Same thing with Jacob, Vayechi Yaakov. You think you're going to read about his life. Indeed, you read about the end of his life, the last years of his life, and basically mostly his passing. And the answer to that, and there are chapters which discuss their lives. So you want to really dedicate a chapter to the life of Sarah, previous two chapters, you can say, especially the previous chapter talks about her life. And the answer is because, as opposed to medical definition and scientific definition of life, which is biological life, and that is physical life as we understand it, the Torah defines life as being what permanent impact did you leave in this world. So life is not about making moves and making noise while you're here. Everyone can do that. What happens when you're physically not here? Are you still making noise? Are you still impacting? Are you still influencing? And when do we see that? After Sarah passes away, you see the love that Abraham bestows on her, where she can reciprocate, chesed shalemus, and goes to far lengths to find a plot for her. In the city of Hebron, Maras HaMachpelah would be called, the double cave, which I'll soon explain and discuss. And then how he goes about finding a bride for Isaac, and how Isaac finally identifies the bride. How? By comparing her to his mother. He brings her to the tent of Sarah, and he sees that Rebecca has the same virtues, the same features, the same qualities as his mother, which of course is very different how today most people don't want to marry someone like their mother. And here Isaac, because his mother was Sarah, and the qualities she had were of the highest sterling character, and so we see that Sarah lives on. So even though of course there's a certain sadness when someone passes away, but imagine that today, almost 3,800 years later, we're still talking about this woman. We read about her every year, and we know where she buried, and we know what kind of life she lived, and we know what kind of son and daughter-in-law she had, and her legacy. That's called life. So Chayei Sarah, you want to really see her life? This chapter captures it. So as such, I've talked about this theme a number of times, but I wanted to focus on something I believe not discussed, especially since Israel's in the news, and including, of course, Jerusalem is always in the news, but there's another city where you see a disproportionate amount of attention, disproportionate amount of attacks and knifings, and that's the holy city of Hebron. I should also mention that this weekend, because the chapter talks about Hebron and Sarah's burial, there's a pilgrimage of thousands and thousands of Jews who go there this Shabbos. Despite what's going on there are even more people I hear going there to show their solidarity. And yet Hebron remains embroiled in controversy. It's a place that there's no peace. There's no peace. and that just adds to the mystery of the location. So we hear of cities, Jerusalem, we hear of Tzvat, we hear of other holy cities, but Hebron is much more obscure and lesser known, and as such, something worthwhile talking about. Now, based on the principle in Judaism, Jewish thought, the concept of microcosm, macrocosm. Go to that other screen I told you and tell me if it's green or red there.
The red is stop, the green says stop, and the green is like light. It's like
the other screen.
Yeah, I get the screen with your picture, yeah.
The green, what do you see, the red or the green? Which is
I see the red, it says stop.
Oh, so leave it. It's fine, just leave it be. Go back to that screen. As long as it doesn't say that the streaming is bad. You know what, just leave it at this screen. If this red stays red, that's good. Okay? You talk about the second screen that I showed, yeah?
It's with your picture on it. The red is like, the red says stop. And it's
Okay, so it's good. So it's rolling, yeah. So in Judaism, there's the concept of microcosm, macrocosm, which means everything that exists on the global scale, on a universal scale, also exists on a smaller scale, on a concentrated scale, based on the principle that the human being is a small universe, and the universe is a large organism. So when we hear about events in Israel, and we hear about events in Hebron, both now and going back thousands of years, what we really are, we have to derive lessons from that are not just lessons about the general picture, but also personal lessons. So in the email I sent out today, I started with the personal questions, like why is life so rife with conflict and with challenges? Is it possible to reconcile the different voices and the different forces that make demands on us, whether it's internal in our inner psyche or people around us? And these are not independent questions of the discussion about Hebron, as we shall soon see. And of course, this broadens to the big question: can we find world peace? Can nations and communities and peoples come to a point of peace? So, the proposition here is that the city, this mysterious city of Hebron, contains the answers to these questions. Often we have to go back in history, in ancient times, to discover the roots of challenges, and then they can inform and help us understand events that are going on today, both, again, as I said, individually and globally. So what is this city of Hebron? The interesting thing is that even though we read in the last week's chapter that God promises Abraham the entire promised land, we all know about the promised land, and he tells him to walk across the land, to walk to the east, to the west. This is the land that you are being promised, that you will inherit, your children will inhabit. This will be the holy promised land. Yet, the first actual specific description of a city in Israel that Abraham owns is Hebron, where in this week's chapter, after Sarah passes away, Abraham comes to Hebron and wants to bury her. So what does he do? He goes and buys a plot called the Moras Machpelah in the city called Kiryat Arba, which is called Hebron, which is also interesting. Kiryat Arba means a city of four. We'll soon discuss why is it called four. What's the four? But this Kiryat Arba has another name called Hebron, which is now the popular name that we know. And in it, there's the plot that called the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. Ma'aras HaMachpelah literally means a double cave. And the reason it's called that, because it became the burial plot, the cave, the spot where the couples dwelled, rested. Which couples? 4 different couples. Adam and Eve, and Abraham knew that Adam and Eve were there. It would be Sarah now, and then Abraham, when he passed away, was buried with Sarah. Then came Isaac and Rebekah, would later be buried there. And finally, Jacob and Leah. Rachel, for reasons not relevant right now, was buried on the road, because that's where she wanted to be able to cry for her children that would later be exiled, as we read later in the chapter of Vayechi, the end of Genesis, how Jacob justifies and explains to Joseph why Rachel was buried not in this sacred spot. So when we go today to Hebron, you'll see it's a pretty big spot, and there are different markers. We don't know exactly where they are, but down there below are the remains. The soul came to rest in that place. As I said, the four couples, which is one of the reasons, by the way, it's called Kiryat Arba, because the city of four, meaning the four couples, obviously the foundational ancestors of the human race, really, Adam and Eve, of course, and then later Abraham, Sarah, and the ones I've just mentioned. So Abraham goes and is not satisfied with receiving this plot as a gift. He actually purchases it. And it's explained in commentary, when you purchase something, it's irreversible. Had the others had given it to him as a gift, the prince that lived there, then a gift can always be retracted. I gave you the gift, now it's over with. A purchase was a final kinyan, a final acquisition, which is irreversible. Today maybe you can understand why Abraham had the foresight to understand to better purchase it than to receive it as a gift, because then anybody can say, I'm the inheritor, I'm the heir to the throne, and that belongs to me. So Hebron becomes the first formal city in Israel, before Jerusalem even. For any other city that becomes in the Torah, in the Bible, in Genesis, becomes legitimately Abraham's. And from there, Abraham would then go on and, of course, acquire the entire land, which again is not for discussion here. So Hebron, interesting, is like you can say the opening door to all of Israel. And indeed, when you look in the mystics and the different sources, which I'm going to quote now, you find very few interesting things about Hebron, which I'm going to share. Let's start with the Zohar. The Zohar asks the question, why is it called Hebron? What's the meaning of the name? So the Zohar says that, and especially the verse says what? Kiryat Arba hu Hebron. So what is the verse trying to tell us? These two names and this is that. So the Zohar says the following. Kiryat Arba, these are the four elements. Eish, Ruach, Mayim, Ofer. These are the four elements that make up a human being and truly all of existence. And hu Hebron, they come together in a chibur, Hebron from the word chibur, that attaches them all. So you can have four elements like fire, water, air, wind and the earth, or whatever order you state them. They could be four separate elements. But they come together in the human being in a form of a chibur, which is a composite. So they come together as one. That's what the Zohar says. So it's interesting, the Zohar therefore gives it relevance as a type of like the unity within diversity, the harmony within diversity, taking the four main archetypes that define existence. And remember, when we talk about four archetypes, we're not talking necessarily physical fire, we're talking about the attributes of fire, the attributes of water, the attributes of earth, the attributes of wind. And these four come together in the human being. In other places it explains, because we have all those four elements. For example, you talk about our breath, which is the breath of life, that's wind. When you talk about our passion, about our fiery passion, when you talk about our blood, which is warm blood, that's the fire, Eish, within us. When you talk about Mayim, of course, a human being is 75% water, liquid. And earth is the minerals and the bones, the skeleton, the structure of our being. So we have all four elements within us, but they don't come together and they're not in conflict, thank God. A healthy human being, they four come together, they join, they work together, they balance each other out. And they're creating, I shouldn't say balance each other out, they complement each other into one harmonious balance. That's what the Zohar says, Hebron. We still need to understand what's the connection, but that's the Zohar. I'm going to cite a few other sources that talk about the Kiryat Arba. Arba sometimes refers to how the city of Hebron was passed on in ownership from Abraham to Judah, then to Kalev ben Yefunah, to the Levim and to the Kohanim. Because later on we'll read that the Hebron becomes one of the Arei Miklat, becomes one of the cities of refuge, where someone who accidentally killed somebody would go escape to. Hebron was one of them, and it belonged particularly to the Levim. It was a place for them to live. Remember, the Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, is told not to own property, so then where are they to live? So the public provided them places for them to live, and one of the places was Hebron. So it was the home of the Levim. Now, interesting, Levi comes from the same meaning, Yelova Alai. Levi also means to attach, like Hebron means connect. Jerusalem is sometimes called Ir Shechurba Lo Yachdov, the city that joins everyone together, because Jerusalem was not split up among the tribes, like all other parts of Israel. It's a city that is like this capital. Everyone belongs there. It united everyone, especially during the holidays when they would go up for the pilgrimages. Okay. Then there's an interesting letter from the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe, Reb Dov Ber of Lubavitch, who was the son of the Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya. He, interestingly, sent his students and family to live in Chevron. This would be approximately the end of early 1800s, probably 1820, 1825. So it's one of the first settlements that came in Chevron was the Mittler Rebbe's family and students that he sent off to Chevron, and actually bought a plot there. Menucha Rachel was the name of his daughter, and she married a Slonim, and that's where they lived until this place, till today. There's an area that is owned by the Mittler Rebbe's, then of course his heirs. And when he did this, he actually around that period he also wrote a letter and describing the virtues of Hebron. So it's a very interesting letter, and I'll just briefly sum up a few things he states there. First on a practical level, Hebron, it says in Shmuel, in Hanavi, the Nevi'im, and the Navi, and the prophet, that King David, before he went to Jerusalem and became king, 7 years he spent in Hebron. The question is why? So the Zohar says, and he quotes, because before he went to Jerusalem, he had to connect himself to the 4 couples that were in Hebron. The question is, what is the meaning behind that? So the Kabbalists explain, what are the 4 couples in the spherotic structure? We know in the spheres, you have, some of you may be familiar with 10 spheres, but when you break it down, there is a structure of the spheres that talks about Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, and Malchus, and the joining of those 4. So we know that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they represent Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes. And let me explain. Abraham, if you think about Abraham, he personified kindness. Hachnos Asarchim, guests. Chesed. The Sefer HaBoyer, the Boyer, which is one of the earliest Kabbalistic works, approximately the same time as Zohar, and actually means a similar meaning. Zohar means splendor or brightness. Boher also means behirus, brightness and illumination. The Sefer HaBoyer is an interesting statement that Chesed of Atzilus, Chesed, the supernal attribute, or you can say archetype of love, once it saw Abraham on earth, said, what do you need me for? Turn to God. You don't need me any longer, this archetype, because you have Abraham who personifies and embodies me on earth. So Abraham wasn't just a kind person. He actually embodied 24/7 what kindness means, which is that archetype. Isaac, his son, Yitzchak, Pachad Yitzchak. Yitzchak corresponds to Gvura. He was far more introverted. His work was more in awe of God. He had a very different type of service. And then Jacob represents Tiferes, compassion. Yaakov, Shapadas, Avram, Rachamim. He's the 3rd pillar. So when you think of it as 3 pillars, we hear sometimes that the world stands on 3 pillars. The Mishnah says, Torah, Aveda, Gemilut Chasadim. Torah is the study of Torah. Okay? That's Tiferes, that's Jacob. There's Tefillah, Aveda. Tefillah, that's Isaac. And Gemilut Chasadim, that's Abraham. As a matter of fact, the Talmud also says that they actually instituted 3 prayers. Abraham instituted Shachris, the morning prayer, Isaac, the afternoon prayer, and Yaakov, the evening prayer. So each one of them represents 3 types of service. But he continues on in that letter the Mittler Rebbe says about Hebron. He says, and that's why Hebron is a place of prayer, and that's why King David had to be there for 7 years before he moved on to Jerusalem to prepare himself. Now you find in the Bible, in the Torah, you'll find another instance. When Kolov ben Yefunah was sent with the other 11 scouts to Israel, so we all know that what happened. 10 of the scouts, unfortunately, miscalculated is the right word, but they sinned gravely by coming back with this terrible report about Israel, and only 2 of the 12 remained connected and committed. They said, we cannot enter this promised land. Who are the 2 that remained? Joshua, it says, because Moses prayed for him as his special student, and Kolov. Why? Why was Kolov different? So it says because he went, when they entered Israel, he went humbly, he went to the Ma'aras Machpelah, he went to Hebron to pray at the graves of the 4 couples that are there. As I said, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Yaakov and Leah. He realized the challenges, and he realized you need prayer, and you need to invoke the schus avos, the merit of our forefathers. And that's where you'll find different expressions. To remind ourselves of the avos. Now, God could have made that they'll all be buried in Jerusalem. So clearly, Hebron has its own, as I said, mysterious power, and which we're middle of discussing. So to continue on, you see that before you enter Jerusalem, Hebron plays a role. Now, he brings something very interesting. We all usually know that prayers, we pray toward what? Wherever we are in the world, we pray toward the east. We pray toward Israel, and Israel toward Jerusalem, and toward the Harabait, toward the Temple Mount. And one of the reasons given for it is because even today, that remains the center of the universe, and our prayers all elevate through that area. However, the Mittler Rebbe here brings, and cites different sources, that the prayers go through Hebron, they elevate through Hebron. So of course, obvious contradiction. Is it through Hebron or through Jerusalem? So the explanation given for this, the Rebbe explained it, and it's based on a Zohar as well. There's a Zohar that says that when Moses came up to heaven, and he was shown the Garden of Eden, he saw that there were 7 doors into the Garden of Eden, and the first door was through Hebron. In other words, all souls go through Hebron before they travel through the other doors, and they end up in their final place in heaven. So based on that, you can explain that it's 2 stages. That the first place everything travels through is Hebron, because that's where our patriarchs and matriarchs lie. They're the foundation of the Jewish people. So even though, for example, we circumcise our children, and the Rambam makes it very clear, we don't circumcise because Abraham got circumcised. We circumcise because there's a mitzvah given at Sinai. That's why we do circumcision. And yet we say, B'brisei shel Avram Avinu alav hashal. We clearly invoke that this was the covenant of Abraham, and it's considered a major merit for us that we are fulfilling Abraham's mitzvah. In other words, so even though Matan Torah, the Sinai, was the place where we formally received the Torah, yet we still connect to the commitment of our forefathers, patriarchs and matriarchs. So though the prayers end up going through Jerusalem, but they go through Hebron and then they go through Jerusalem, basically. So Hebron plays a far more significant role than most people know. It's not a small town, as I just mentioned. And as a matter of fact, going back to what I said earlier, the first place in the Torah, the first city that is actually, I don't want to say the word occupied, it's not a good word today. The first city where the Jew Abraham, the promised land, even though, as I said in last week's chapter, God promises Abraham the whole city, the whole country rather, the whole promised land, to travel, walk around the entire land. But the first city that is formally given to Abraham, or you could say formally purchased by Abraham permanently, is Hebron. So when you think of it that way, you can understand why the Torah makes a big fuss about it. It's not happened to be a circumstantial thing that Sarah ended up in Hebron, that's why they buried her there. Hebron has that power. So what exactly is this mystique of Hebron? So I mentioned before, I go back to the Zohar. It's unity, chibur. Hebron comes from the word chibur. The unity of the 4 Yuseidus, as he says. Kiryat Arba is the city of 4. The 4 elements. It's also the 4 couples. And the 4 couples correspond to the 4 elements. As I mentioned, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob is chesed, gvura, teferes, love and kindness, discipline and compassion. And Adam and Eve, what are they? In Kabbalistic, in the Sphiratic structure, they're called Malchus. Some places it says Keser Malchus, the crown. But Malchus and Keser are interchangeable in this sense, because what you want to have is the Yichud, the Chibur, Chevron, of Chesed, Gvur, Teferes, and Malchus. Now I know what I just said sounds a little esoteric, more than a little. Let me explain what that means in simple language. In simple language, for a human being to be complete, we are not single-celled organisms. We're not amoebas, and we're not single-celled organisms. We have 75 trillion cells, actually, give or take a few. But that's the number. So a human being, what's fascinating about the human being is that Maimonides writes this in his introduction to the Mishnayos and to Pirkei Avos and so on. He writes that all creatures on earth are poel echad or beis poelim. All creatures on earth have either one personality or two personalities. Like, for example, you'll find certain birds are very compassionate and certain birds are very aggressive. Same thing is with, like, for example, the erev, which is the raven, and the dove are two simple symbols of that. You won't find that one of them is compassionate sometimes and sometimes cruel. That's how their nature is. And the same thing with all creatures on earth, they're wired a certain way. And that's their wiring. You can't expect of a creature to go to therapy and try change its wiring or change its attitudes and personality. Human beings, he says, however, are made of many pa'alim. Pa'alim means many personalities. And I'm not talking now whether we're talking about multiple personality disorder. That's not what I'm discussing. I'm talking about even a normal, healthy person has different personalities. What does that mean? You can be compassionate. You can sometimes be less compassionate. You have many, many different elements, and you have ability to restrain and refrain and control and channel and so on. Because the key to a human being is created in the image of God. If you look in the Bible, when it talks about the creation of Adam and Eve, it says God took earth from all over the globe, and that was the earth that he took. Why did he have to take from all over the globe? Take from one section, take earth, and imbue it with a soul of life. Why did it have to take earth from all over? Some places it says El Yenim and Tachtenim, from every part of existence. And the answer is a very obvious one, because the human being is charged with something that no other creature on earth is charged, to elevate the entire universe. Since our job is to bring together, chibur, to connect and bring together the entire universe, instead of it being a fragmented universe, to turn it into something that's unified, harmonious, toward one larger goal, larger purpose, that's why the human being has to have a piece of every part of the world. And that's why Olam Katan Zeh Adam, a human being, is a microcosm. And we have Eish in us, and we have Ruach, as I mentioned before, and we have Mayim, and we have Ofar. We have fiery personality, we have hot blood, we have passion, that's the fire inside of us. We have the wind in us, is Yipach Ba'apav, as I said, the breath, our breath, the breath of life is Ruach. We have water, of course. 75% of the human being is made of water. And the minerals, the structure of the human being, our bodies, our skeleton, our bones, our teeth, the structure are made of mineral. That's daimon. That's offer. That's based on a mineral based. So a human being is a composite of everything in existence, because now that we have every piece in us, so when we behave in a unified way in our own personal lives, we have the power to elevate and unify the rest of existence, which is all microcosm, macrocosm. It's actually, if this was said a few hundred years ago, it would sound like some type of mumbo jumbo. Today, it's very commonly accepted that the whole universe is, the large universe is all captured. One atom reflects all the atoms. So it's not so surprising to say that a human being has the ability to affect the universe, because we have the entire universe within us in a concentrated microcosmic form. So basically you can say we enter a fragmented world that has scattered agendas and so many different forces going in different directions, with a purpose of us human beings taking the different fragments of our lives and directing it toward one purpose, which is essentially the concept when we say that Adam and Eve, the first Rosh Hashanah in existence, which was the day they were created, the first Friday, sixth day of creation, what did they do? When they were created, they came to the entire universe. They said, let us all together gather together in one symphony and sing to God, one song. That is, in essence, you can say, the purpose of life, is to take so many forces that are going in so many different directions, conflicting directions, selfishness, everyone in their own agenda, and bring it all together to show that it all complements as one symphony, one divine cosmic symphony. And it's the human being that is the conductor and able to bring it all together. So we essentially embody the concept of Hebron. That's what Hebron is. That's why Adam and Eve, the first human beings on earth, and then later Abraham, Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah, that's where they are interred. That's where they are. Because they embody the foundational elements of the human race. Adam and Eve is obvious, but then come the other three, because it's not just Adam and Eve, you can say, are the father and mother of all human beings. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they structured into Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, the pillars. Because remember, as I said before, we're not just individuals. If you look at a human being, you'll see our structure is made up of three. Everything in our being is three. You have a right brain, a left brain, and a center brain. You have a right arm, a left arm, and a center, a spine. We have a right leg and a left leg, as well as the center. So when you look at the Kabbalistic structure of the spheres, it really is like a triangle, like three triangles. There's right, left, center, right, left, center, right, left, center. So if you ever saw the sphere's structure, it's like the human being. It's like the right brain, Chachma, the left brain, Bina, the center, Das. The right arm or the right side, Chesed, the left side, Gvura, and the middle is Tiferes, the heart, compassion. Then comes Netzach on the right side, the right leg, Hoid on the left leg, and the sexual organs, the genitals, are the center, Yesod, and then Malchus. Yesod is usually the masculine, Malchus the feminine. So there's the structure of the human being is not just linear. We are made of a structure. What would a human being, if we didn't have, God forbid, a spine? You wouldn't have the centrifugal element that creates balance. It gets even more fascinating if you really want to go deeper into it. Look at the Mishkan, the way the temple was built. First, the portable sanctuary in the wilderness, and then later the final temple, the permanent temple in Jerusalem. How is it structured? You'll see again, it's right, left, center. Also, three components: the Holy of Holies, where there's only one element in the Holy of Holies, the brain. What is that? The Torah, the Aron. The Ark is in the Holy of Holies. Then comes the Kodesh, which corresponds to the torso. So you have the right, left, and center. What's on the right? You have on the right the Shulchan, which bestows Mozen, which is Chesed. It gives food, sustenance. On the left you have the menorah, Eish, fire, Gvura. And the center you have the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the sometimes called Mizbeach HaKteris, the altar of incense. And that corresponds to Tiferes, compassion, a beautiful scent and aroma and so on. Then you have the third section, which corresponds to the legs, and that's the Oyel Moed, or the Chotzer, outside. That there you have only one Mizbeach HaChitzon. What is its role? To be an interface between the world and the temple. You bring offerings of animals that do not have that type of so-called silence of incense within the internal. That's already taking an outer world and transforming it. I discussed this at length a number of years ago, the microcosm, how the temple is a parallel and mirror image of the human being. This is based on the Shalah, the Bachai. There's a whole many commentaries that talk about this. There's actually a whole sefer, a whole book called Chayei Sarah from the Ramah, Moshe Isserlish, who was one of the great classic codifiers. They call him the mappa, the tablecloth, because when Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote a Shulchan Aruch, which means a set table, and they call the Ramah the mappa, the so-called tablecloth, because he added his commentary that filled in and essentially rounded out. And the Ramah was more, Beis Yosef is more of a Sfardi, Ramah is more Ashkenaz, meaning coming from the different schools, but it's all published in one code of Jewish law. So the Ramah has a book called Chayei Sarah. He was also a Kabbalist, as was the Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef has a sefer called Magid Misharim, which is a Kabbalistic work, and the Ramah has a Kabbalistic work, which is called Chayei Sarah, where he specifies every detail of the temple and how you find it in the spiritual worlds and in our personal lives, our personalities. But suffice it to say, relevant to our discussion here, is that the human being is a microcosm of everything. As is the temple, V'shachanti b'seicham, I shall rest among you. It doesn't say I will rest in it, because the temple was essentially a place where the divine rests, a model for the divine presence in our lives. And today, Shachanti b'seichem, b'seich kol echad v'echad, or achas, the temple that we build spiritually in our homes, in our lives, through prayer is like offerings, and so on. So we recreate it in our own way today until we will merit to the third temple, the permanent Migdash Adnei Keni Yadecha, when Mashiach comes. But to go back to Hebron, therefore, so Hebron, the fact that these four couples are on Hebron is because they embody the theme of Hebron embodies the theme of these people. And this is what? To create unity. Like go back to the Zohar now. One line in the Zohar takes Kiryat Arba Hu Hebron, that the four archetypes or the four what do I call them? The four elements join as one. That's Arba is Hebron, Chibur. So it's about creating harmony within diversity. Now Jerusalem has elements of that too. I mentioned before, Ir Shachubra Lo Yagdov, Kiryat Melech Rov. You have things, expressions about, and Jerusalem becomes the capital of Israel. But why? But before King David went to Jerusalem, he spent 7 years, the Navi tells us, Shmuel, in Hebron, because to prepare, to elevate Jerusalem, of course, is the place where the temple is built. And yet, it's actually played now the temple is built, Maimonides writes, that the earth, that Adam originates from Yerushalayim. He came from the Har HaBayis, it says. Mokem kaparose nivra. It's an interesting expression. He says that the kapara, which is the forgiveness, the atonement of a person, is through what? Is through an offering. Where's the offering brought? In the temple in Jerusalem. So it says, Mokem kaparose nivra, a human being was created from the place that would bring him atonement. So though the earth was gathered from all over the world, but the primary place where Adam was created was from the Temple Mount. And yet he was placed in the Garden of Eden, which is not the Temple Mount. And he's buried and lies today in Hebron, which is also not the Temple Mount. So clearly, everything has its role. The Temple Mount is ultimately the place where God rests. But to prepare for that, Hebron has a critical role because Hebron emphasizes that chibur, that joining. Which of course explains another thing. Why didn't Abraham could have easily taken Sarah to Jerusalem and buried? He knew that Jerusalem had its power. He even gave it the name. It was named Yira, then the name Shalom. He added the word Yira. Later they joined it together, it became Yerushalayim. But because Hebron has its own particular power, and the power of bringing that joining. In a way, you could say that Yerushalayim is Ira Kodesh, is the place of holiness. But Hebron is a place where maybe the interface between the material fragmentation of a material world and the unity that's necessary. Because you don't say that on Jerusalem. You don't say Jerusalem brings together the four elements. Jerusalem is Yerushalayim Ira Kodesh. It's already a holy place. Hebron is like a type of interface between diversity and harmony. But the goal is that it should become a chibur, a unity. And the language of, as I said, of the spheres is the unity of Keser and Malchus with Chesed, Gvura, and Teferes. So Adam and Eve is Keser and Malchus. They're like the foundation. And then that breaks down into the three kavim, the three pillars I mentioned, right, left, and center. This is Abraham, Sarah is right, left is Isaac and Rebekah, and center Jacob and Leah. So, what this means in our personal lives, it means the following: that Hebron is a central component in our lives as well, even though we still understand that the prayers go through Jerusalem, but to get through Jerusalem, you have to pass through Hebron. You have to go through the Ovis. Kolov did it, King David did it, and we do it as well in our own spiritual way. So I don't know if the people going to Israel, going to Hebron this Shabbos, the pilgrimage they're making, and I see you two are probably not going to be there, right? Hebron. This weekend. Yeah. A lot of people go there because of Chayei Sarah. So I don't know if they know this, but Hebron carries that power, which explains, of course, sad events. Wherever there's power, there's adversity. That's how it is. The more powerful something is, the more the klippas, the negative forces gather. Just on a very basic level, with this arid, dry, and there's no moisture, there's no life. Maggots and insects and parasites don't gather. Where do bacteria gather? With this life. Why, for example, God forbid, someone goes into surgery, you see in those inner chambers where a human body is opened up, it has to be unbelievably sterilized. The doctors, everyone has to be covered up. Why? Because when the body is closed and you have a healthy layer of skin and hair and all the layers that protect, it doesn't allow most of destructive bacteria to enter. But once a body is opened, that's where the bacteria go, because that's where there's real life force. So wherever you see a lot of energy being invested, rest assured there's a lot of power there. That's one of the reasons that sexuality is one of the most regulated laws in Torah, because sexuality has the power of creation. It's the most powerful force in existence. And anything with a lot of power will always have forces on the other side trying to hijack it. Where there's no power, no one's interested. You only go with his strength, Who was it, the big bank robber? Willie, who was it? One of the big bank robbers in the 18th, 19th century. They asked him, why does he rob banks? She says, because that's where the money is. Very obvious answer. Was he going to go rob a place where there's no money? So wherever there's money, there's robbers. Wherever there's power, that's where everybody wants to gather. Which is, by the way, how do we recognize many of the antibodies? Like if you want to know if an infection has entered a human being, God forbid, you see the white blood cells. Because when they gather to fight, that they know, because that's where there's power. You'll always see that bacteria gather in places where there's a lot of energy. Now actually this is based on Jewish law, very basic law. For example, there's a prohibition that we're not allowed to eat blood. You can eat meat, you can eat things that have blood in them. We have to drain the blood, there's rules of how to salt it and so on. But eating blood directly is a direct prohibition. And it's an interesting answer, an interesting reason given the Torah. In Pasharei, in Deuteronomy, Ki Adam hu nefesh. Because blood is life itself, so te'eva, it's something that one shouldn't touch. Now this point here is not because it's disgusting, like someone thinks, who would want to drink blood? Vampires drink blood. But why is the prohibition? What's the prohibition? You could even make an argument, what's going on here? Everything you eat is going to be broken down to your bloodstream. So why wait for the whole digestive process? Just drink blood originally and it becomes immediately blood. What do you need to go through a whole digestive system, if you think about it? And of course, if it's that way, God would have made it that it wouldn't be repulsive. So for example, we eat anything, what happens? The waste is eliminated from the body. The digestive system incorporates and breaks down the elements, the minerals and the vitamins, etc., and then absorbs it in your blood. That's exactly what happens. Food becomes your blood. Of course, after it expels the waste. So why should it be such a crime to eat blood? Then all you're doing is you're just bypassing the whole process. And the answer given is the commentaries talk about it, because damu nefesh, it's the life force itself. So there, all the bacteria, so-called spiritual bacteria, tuma, in the word in Hebrew, we say tuma, tara. So, everyone translates it as pure and impure. But what does that mean? Maimonides makes it very clear. Tuma is not physical impurities where you take a shower and you clean it off. You have to go to a mikveh. And sometimes you need a special mikveh, mayim chayim, for particular impurities. Why can't you just go into a bathtub or take a shower or jump into an ocean? I'm talking about the cases where that's not sufficient. The answer is because it's not about physical impurity. You're not talking about washing off grime or dirt. You're talking about a spiritual impurity. So what's a spiritual impurity? What does that mean even? So you can think of it as a spiritual toxin. Where do these toxins gather? They will gather only where there's a lot of life. Dam hua nefesh, life, they go straight for the life force. Where do mosquitoes bite? They don't just bite anywhere, they bite where there's blood. Parasites, like mosquitoes, there's another word. What are the other blood-sucking, the bloodsuckers? Leeches. They go for the blood because that's where the life is. So when something has a lot of power, you need to have a great care or else it can be contaminated. So the Torah says, eat food the way it is, let it break it down properly, let the body break down until it absorbs. If you go straight to the blood, it's going to have too much power and too much negative tumah can gather there. And there are other examples for this. Wherever there's a lot of holiness, you'll always see there's a lot of great care taken. You can't just go into the Holy of Holies whenever you like. Why not? What's the big thing? You're not going into a bad place. It's not a God forbid, a place of negativity. It's the holiest place on earth. So why not just go in whenever you want? You want to go in. The answer is because it's holiness, and you're not holy. So you're not holiness. You're gonna your impurities, your toxins are going to feed off a holy place. If you want to put it in more psychological terms, think of it this way: sexual abuse is one of the worst types of abuse. I'm not going to minimize other type of abuse, but it's one of the worst. Why? Because you're entering the holy of holies of a human being, which is their intimate place. This is the place that they have no defenses. You're not just touching someone on a external level. And wherever something is extremely powerful, and sexuality is very powerful, as we know, that if you don't enter there in the wrong way, you create terrible damage. To use another example, I mentioned this, the Jigan and Shuchmach, these were the Jewish linguist comedians of, I know you're going to ask what the connection is, you'll see in a second. So they have one of their Yiddish jokes they have is that the Jewish theory of relativity, we know there's a theory of relativity, Einstein, but there's a Jewish theory of relativity which goes like this: 3 hairs on your head isn't much, right? I can tell you that. But 3 hairs in your soup, same 3 hairs. That's the theory of relativity. It all depends where. 3 hairs on your head is nothing, but 3 hairs in the soup, nobody is going to, even 1 hair in the soup. So, like a piece of dust on your eyeball is not like a piece of dust on your finger. On your finger, who cares? But on your eyeball, it's such a sensitive place, 1 piece of dust is extremely irritating. Revav al beged shel Talmid Chacham. It's a very strong statement. The Talmud says that if there's a revav, a stain, or a different ways it's interpreted, on a garment of a scholar, he's considered a certain death penalty he may deserve. Death penalty, people get their things stained. Because on something that's extremely holy, extremely precious, and even 1 stain is too much. The Holy of Holies was the most vulnerable place on earth, because it's the holiest place on earth. So if you're as holy as the Holy of Holies, no problem. You could stay there all day. But there's no one that holy. After the eating of the tree of knowledge, there is no such holiness in the world. That's why the Kohen Gadol had to go in, the high priest, very carefully. Bezeis Yovei Aaron. And Nadav and Avihu rushed in too quickly, not because they were criminal, they were great people. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh says that they rushed in because of their ecstasy and their passion. The first day the temple was erected, they wanted to be there and take advantage of the spirituality. They didn't go in there for any corrupt reasons. It was for pure reasons. But they went in, they rushed. They went in too quickly. They weren't ready. The different explanations. So it was Eish Zara. It was like going into the Holy of Holies and you're not completely on that level, and they got burned out. And they literally died. So then God says, Achrei Mois, after the death of the 2 children of Aaron, Bezeis, here's how you do it. The humility necessary, 7 days of preparation before Yom Kippur, and then how he enters, and the high priest would go in with ropes. Because if he had 1 blemish, like a blemish on the eye, he would die there. Because the Holy of Holies could not tolerate that. It's too much. That same blemish elsewhere wouldn't be a significant thing, but there, because there's so much power. Wherever there's a lot of power. I don't like to bring this example because it's such a negative one, but it's an accurate example. Many people wonder why you don't find many deaths from what they call yenamachla, cancer, in previous, like before 50, 60 years ago. Suddenly cancer became one of the biggest killers. So some say, because cancer was there, but people died before, for other reasons, before cancer could set in, so you don't have cancer as such a cause. As longevity, as our age expectancy went up, so suddenly this. Maybe, maybe not. Others argue, exact opposite, that cancer is a direct result of the discovery of nuclear energy and atomic energy. And when you go on that level, it releases radioactivity. So we know the power of atomic energy, nuclear energy. Tremendous power. It changed the world in many ways. But we know if there's a leak coming from that inner dimension, the devastation it creates is worse than any disease. Because it attacks the cells, and what cancer does, it attacks in the deepest part of your being. And not your being, no one's being, no one should ever know of it. But it's another example, a negative example, of when there's a lot of power, there's always potential for a lot of damage. That doesn't mean that's why it has to be regulated properly. So going back to our discussion, I have no doubt in my mind, the promised land, Israel, is the smallest country in the world almost. It's the size of New Jersey. I mean, it's not the smallest country in the world. I should correct myself. It's not small. But relatively speaking. And yet, it dominates headlines. It's been the place of conflict from almost the time of Abraham. Even a little later, you want to say, but basically thousands of years. First, when the Jews entered Israel after they went from Egypt, the wars that were fought then. And even later the battles fought by King David, and then King Solomon was relatively peaceful. But then the battles after that. The Babylonians wanted, the Persians wanted it, the Greeks wanted it, the Syrians wanted it, everybody, the Assyrians, everybody, Israel, Jerusalem, Rome. What did they want from Jerusalem? You have a nice country in Italy, Europe, conquer the whole Europe. No, everybody wants Jerusalem, a piece of Jerusalem, piece of Israel, promised land. And then the Romans, and then after the Romans come the Byzantines, and then come the Ottomans. I don't even know the order, it doesn't matter. And of course the Great Crusades, quote unquote great. And then come the Muslims. They decided, Israel. Mecca and Medina is not enough, they're holy cities. Jerusalem isn't even mentioned in the Quran. The answer is very simple. Where there's great power, everybody wants a peace. Nobody knows why, but they want a peace. I remember walking once the night, Friday night, the streets of Old City of Jerusalem, thinking to myself, I had my little thoughts, all the cats all over the place. So I read up why there's so many cats in the Old City, because Montefiore, Sir Moses Montefiore, who rebuilt Jerusalem, there were a lot of rats when he came because it was like a dump. The place was a wilderness. Now everybody says that they love it, but there was a time when the Jews were not there, the place was a wilderness. There were a lot of rats. So he imported from England a lot of cats to get rid of the rats. So I created a poem in my mind that now the cats have become the rats. Okay, maybe they're Gulgulim or something. They're reincarnations of people who want another piece of the action. But I remember I was walking through Shah Jaffa to the Old City. It was late at night. And I see the Armenian quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter. Okay, I understand the Christian Muslims, have been fighting for it. Where did the Armenians come from? So I went to read up on it. I don't know. After the British Empire felt guilty, so they gave them a piece of Anyway, it's part of the Shagasan in Jerusalem. So there's no question in my mind, Jerusalem and Hebron, the two hot spots. Especially when you understand the spirituality of it. Everybody wants a peace. They don't know why. There's an expression, Mazlayo Chazi. By Daniel, with his, they came to our place and they all started trembling. They said, what are you trembling for? They said, because even though they don't see, their mazel sees. Sometimes our unconscious feels things. The unconscious of the world knows that Jerusalem has power and Hebron has power. And that's why they gravitate there. There's no question about that in my mind. That's the root of it all. And that's why there's no peace. Hebron, I was reading a medrash that says concerning this chapter, it says there are three cities that are unquestionably Jewish and no one will ever challenge. But everyone's challenging now. I don't know how that means, but that's what it says. Which are the three? Jerusalem, I think, Hebron for sure, and Shechem, where Joseph lies. Yet another burial place. Now what they have with Shechem, I have no clue at all. Shechem doesn't even, here you could say at least, they claim Abraham, Abraham's the father of Yishmael. Isaac and Jacob are not. But Abraham's the father of Yishmael. But Shechem, what does Shechem have to do with them? Okay, another question among many questions we have. I'm not trying to answer. The point is there's holiness and power. And I have to cite this medrash, which is fascinating. It says in the medrash that if the non-Jewish nations knew how much the temple protected them, they would have surrounded it with legions and not allow anyone to touch the temple. It's a very interesting statement. In other words, the Jewish temple, Jerusalem, and I would say Hebron too in its way, the patriarchs, we know they pray for us. We know that Rachel prays for us. It's not just for the Jewish people, they pray for peace for all people. And if the nations of the world knew it, not only would they not try to attack it, they would protect it because how much power they get from it. On Sukkot, we offer 70 offerings corresponding to the 70 nations. Most Jews don't know it, and non-Jews for sure don't know it. So it's a very interesting irony in this whole tragedy, that in truth, the power of the so-called the energy plant and the source code for the entire world is Hebron and Jerusalem. And that's perhaps why they're trying to grab pieces of it, but they're doing exact opposite of what's good for them. Because they will only be powerful when you leave it alone and let it be, instead of trying to own or control it. So the relevance of this week's chapter, even though it's almost 3,900 years, I think, something like that, since Sarah passed away, to be exact, something like that. It's around 3,900 years. You were there when it happened? Now, he like knows dates, so sometimes I think like you were there. Yeah. Well, so our great-grandmother Sarah passed away and left us the legacy where we know where she is, and with Abraham and now and the others, and they are relevant, and it's relevant today as it is then, even more so because you see the battles that are being fought. On the personal level, what it comes down to, that really Chevron, as the name Chibur implies, is about joining. It's about unity, which, you could say, 1 second, Israel now is in a state of complete disunity. All the attacks, even Jews can't get along. I'm not going to go into details of how Jews turn on Jews, but you could think that it's like everything opposite of Chevron. But it's not that way. When we hear it's Chevron, it's a lesson in life. Maybe that's the solution. We know the temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, because of baseless hatred. Simply people turning on each other. Jews on Jews. So the tikkun, the repair, is to eliminate the cause, which is how? By avas chinam, baseless love. You love somebody for no other reason but because they are who they are, not because you get anything from them. So the tikkun, sometimes when you want to find the healing of a problem, you have to look right where the problem is. Right where the problem is the healing. The healing is Chevron, to be in a state of Chevron, of chibur, of unity. Unity is always the force that brings healing in the world. Think of it on a very medical level even. What is the key? What is behind a definition of all disease and illness? Disconnection. That's what it is. The blood flow is not flowing properly. There's an infection. There's an impediment, not letting someone breathe properly. The arteries are blocked. You'll see all these words: blockages, impediments. And what is health? A free flow. Breathing, exhaling and inhaling properly. The circulation flowing properly to the extremities. There's no impediments and no blockages and no disturbances. It's flow. It's like, we call it that it's breathing in the big sense of it. So the concept of healing is always connected to connections. And the same thing is also psychologically. When someone experiences anxiety, fear, any type of psychic pain of all forms, what if you really break it down, what are you feeling? You're feeling broken into pieces. Like in lack of focus, you feel constrained, you don't feel free. You can just do anything you want. Fear is a killer because it breaks up things. So it's all about disconnection. When a person feels really good about themselves, self-confidence, and they're brimming with self-esteem and so on, they feel everything you feel like you belong, you feel like things are connected, you feel you can take on anything. You don't feel that's why people in fear or depressed, what do? They withdraw. They isolate themselves. They don't want to be with other people. Which is why one of the solutions, for example, simcha in Judaism, simcha, you can't have simcha's crazy, you can't have a simcha by yourself. Pleasure you could have on your own. You could read a book, you could listen to music, you could, think of an idea, pleasurable. But simcha is always with others. That's why by Moedim and Simcha holidays, is a mitzvah to have guests. Shabbos is also a mitzvah, but it's not quite, because Shabbos is also b'yem simchaschem ela Shabbosis, but Shabbos is more einig pleasure than it is joy. So Shabbos, technically, you could celebrate. You could internally experience it. But Yom Tov is specifically, that's why it says, b'sharecha, with your family and so on, the pilgrimages and the three Shalosh Regalim, it's community-based. Now, again, Shabbos is also community-based, but I'm just being technical a bit. Because Simcha is impossible. A person makes a wedding. They want to invite friends. You don't want to celebrate just with yourself and your wife and your children. Because Simcha is a, what we call it, spills over, it's free-flowing. You want to connect, and you'll overlook differences with people. It creates unity. And what's depression, the opposite of Simcha? The opposite, atzvus, sadness, and so on. It's isolating, aloneness. Nobody understands me. Nobody, they won't like me if they know me. It's everything. It's a fragmenter. It's a divider. So the concept of Chevron, unity, is the key to all healing. Is the key to all problems. Why was the temple destroyed? Because people hated each other. What's the connection? So people don't like each other. That's why there's no temple. Because a father cannot come and dwell among his children if the children are fighting with each other. The separation between them doesn't let him be there. Doesn't want to be there. When the children are together, everybody, the parent wants to be there. So unity is not just unity for ourselves. Barchenu avinu kolanu ke'echad. The Baal Tanya interprets it. So usually we interpret Barchenu avinu kolanu, God should bless us all together. That's a simple interpretation. But if you think about it, it's when kolanu ke'echad, that's when Barchenu avinu. You stand as one. That's a keli, a container for blessings. How does the Gemara end? In the last Mishnah. The only keli, the only container that God found, and it's like a negative. It means li'ikuva. He didn't say matzasi shalom keli kleima. Lo matza kadosh baruch hu keli machzik bracha. He didn't find anything. He looked everywhere and couldn't find a container for peace. For blessing. Only shalom. You could say, well, that's a pretty big statement. There's no other container? What happens if I give a lot of charity? Or I do a lot of mitzvahs? No. You don't have shalom. The real bracha cannot dwell. Because blessings, which is more than just a blessing, it's health. It's everything that's functional, everything that's positive in life needs to have a keli, needs to have a container. A broken container cannot allow blessings to rest. It'll just spill out, if not worse. So Chevron is the concept of shalom. As we know, peace in Judaism, the word peace, is not just absence of war. Just like love is not just the absence of hate, right? Even though some people feel it is. Love is a force of its own. And just like shalom means also complete, it means harmony, it means it's more than just no hate. With no hate, we have peace. That's maybe a functional ceasefire. But the real shalom is a completion. Where everything is, as I said, breathing, everything is everything is complementing each other. It's a full functioning human being. Look at a healthy child. Healthy child, everything is working well. You ever see a newborn breathe? You see their chest going up and down. The lungs are completely being filled. By the time we're aged 15, they say, we're only using 3/4 of our lungs. Because the toxins settle in. Try it out. When we breathe in all the way, you'll see most people will cough. I mean, you condition yourself, whether you run for a marathon or something like that, so you can recondition. But the toxins of life begin to weaken our bodies, and our bodies begin to break down, so the flow of life force doesn't go through as smoothly. A child, it's seamless. It's like an air in a balloon, without any blockages. So Chevron represents that form of seamless flow and unity, and on a practical level, it's about our obligation to find that type of peace. And that's why, we pray and we keep in mind the patriarchs and the matriarchs and Adam and Eve and Chevron. So it helps our prayers create that type of unity. And then once a person finds some type of unity within themselves, it's easier then to unite with other people. So this is a little brief overview of Chevron. I felt I should talk about it because when I was researching it a bit, I found a lot of interesting stuff, as I shared with you some of it, that is unknown really, and especially with the center in the news. It says, when you study the Torah of something, when you learn about something, it's as if you fulfill that mitzvah. So by talking about Hebron, it gives strength to a city like that to have the peace it needs and deserves, especially with the Jews going there this Shabbos. They should all have menucha there properly. Like I said, menucha Rachel, who was there. And for Jews everywhere, especially in Israel now. I was just talking to a few people. We don't like to say negative things, but it's not a pleasant scene there. Because now it's like there's this hovering cloud where anyone's target practice. So it's a tragedy, actually. So, God should protect every Jew there, every Jew everywhere. And if we really maybe understood what Hebron was about, and maybe we can convey it to the rest of the world, they really appreciate. Maybe instead of all that we're having, they would surround these cities and protect them, because they realize that their blessings come from there. So we have our work cut out, and meanwhile we have to do what we have to do. So I hope I did some justice to this theme this week, Sarah's burial in Hebron. And Hebron becomes one of those four, as I said, four holy cities that is called the four Ayoros HaKodesh, which is Yerushalayim, Hebron, Tzvas, and Tveria are the four. Did I say four or I say five here now? Yerushalayim, Hebron, Tzvas, and Tveria. Four. Those are the four. Yerushalayim, Hebron, Tzvas, Tveria. Yeah. Huh? Shechem is also, but there's, when the Arizal talks about the four, talks about these four cities, other places as well. The whole land is a holy land. It's all levels. So God should bless, as I said, everybody there, everybody here. We should take the lesson to heart, do whatever we can to rise above the pettiness, transcend the narishkeiten, the nonsense that is so preoccupies our lives. If you have no nonsense in your life, God bless you, great. It's almost impossible not to have nonsense if you have a mobile phone and a computer. There's always some shtusim coming through, right? If not most. I don't know. It has its blessings, like I said before, like everything with great blessings has great challenges. So may we take the great blessings and know how to channel it and just take advantage of the greatness and discard the rest. So God bless you all, both here and online. And again, I want to dedicate the class. Let me read the dedication. Sorry about that. In loving memory of Avram Ber ben Yosef Ephraim Halevi, upon his third yahrzeit this Shabbos, Chayei Sarah, Cheshvan 25th, dedicated by his son Greg. May his neshama continue to bring blessings to Greg and to your entire family, and to all of us. And until next week, Wednesday. This has been Wednesday Night Live with Rabbi Jacobson. Everyone have a very blessed and pleasant and beautiful week. Thank you.